National security reporter for NBC News, and Julie Hirschfeld-Davis, who covers the White House for the New York Times. Ken, you and I got on the phone earlier in the day when this news first broke, and you sort of pointed out the drama of this moment. Is it some thought that perhaps Bob Mueller, in an effort to sort of turn the heat down on some of this, wouldn't permit Jim Comey to testify in an open hearing? But that's exactly what he did today.
That's right, Nicole. The issue, not only not turn the heat down, but there was some speculation that Mueller may not have wanted Comey to alert potential witnesses to what his story is on some of these matters. You know, after all, there's been allegations that some people view as obstruction of justice. Recall that Comey is saying through intermediaries that President Trump asked him to drop the investigation into Mike Flynn, that he called him to dinner and asked him to pledge his loyalty. And so we have these other stories about Trump asking other intelligence officials to say there was no collusion. So there was some worry and concern that Mueller would say, you know what, Jim, maybe you shouldn't testify after all. That's not what happened. Our reporting is that Mueller has cleared Comey to testify publicly. It could happen as early as next week, although that may slip. We're told the schedule hasn't been firmed up, and it promises to be one of the more dramatic hearings in recent Washington memory, Nicole.
And Julie, you're very well sourced inside our country's law enforcement agencies. The last we saw of Jim Comey, he was cleaning his lawn. He sent a very gracious letter to his FBI staff, who the last they saw of him was when he was boarding that plane. He learned that he'd been fired by this president while he was addressing staff in Los Angeles. But since that moment, Donald Trump, in front of Russians, has called him crazy. He called him a nut job, and he said that his firing relieved pressure on Donald Trump in terms of allowing him to work with more ease with the Russians. What is pent up inside of a Jim Comey, or is it all just strategic and a brick-by-brick case that he'll lay out when he testifies?
Well, I think there was clearly a lot of pent up worry on Jim Comey's part in the weeks after Donald Trump became president, which we know he documented in internal memos and made sure that there was a record of. And so I think, you know, he obviously has quite a lot to say, and we've heard some of it through, as you mentioned, leaks of some of what's in these memos about his takeaways from some of these confrontations with the president, where he was asked to do things that he felt uncomfortable with. He felt he was being influenced, or that there was an attempt to influence him that was really something that was outside the bounds of the relationship between a president and the FBI director. So he obviously does have a lot to say, and it's interesting. Ken is talking about how there was an anticipation that, you know, maybe Jim Comey would be asked to keep quiet during this investigation at least until Mueller had a chance to interview him himself. I know, you know, there has been a lot of concern on Capitol Hill among Republicans and Democrats that the special counsel investigation was going to essentially shut down a lot of these public disclosures that Jim Comey clearly has to make and that others have to make about what went on here. And what we've seen today is that's not going to happen. And so this is going to be another moment where the White House is going to have to deal with an account of these issues that they don't really care to have public right now.
So, Ken, if you just look at the last 12 hours, President Trump is back in the White House after his trip, and he's back with his gateway drugs of cable TV and his Twitter handle. How do you think seeing Jim Comey, who he thought he had washed his hands of, testify before Congress, and we know that he's an effective messenger for his own case, whether you agree with it or not can be debated. How do you think this White House is going to deal with the spectacle of what will surely be roadblock coverage of a fired FBI director who the president, as I said, called a nut job and crazy, testifying in an open session?
Well, we learned today that one way they're going to try to deal with it is to not answer any more questions about it from the podium. Sean Spicer said that he referred questions today to the outside counsel who's handling Russia matters for President Trump. But, you know, let's remember that, you know, according to some very good reporting in the New York Times, Jared Kushner and others advised President Trump that firing Comey would be a popular thing, would be a political win among Democrats. So they appear to be blindsided by the incredible reaction to this. And that's leaving aside, you know, these memos and this notion that Comey is putting forth that President Trump didn't seem to understand that there is a tradition of independence granted to the FBI director, and that it's not really appropriate for the president to be asking for loyalty or asking for status updates for investigations or suggesting directions of investigations. And so, you know, it's kind of a mystery to me how this White House is dealing with it, but it's not good news for them.
Julie, I want to put a question to you about what sort of legal peril there could be for a White House where we now know that the investigation reaches into the highest levels of the West Wing senior staff, the highest levels of the president's family, and you've still got the president. I think this morning he was tweeting away about why Carter Page hasn't been his former aide, who on the one hand Donald Trump said he hardly knew, on the other hand in a Washington Post Ed board meeting said it was the first national security advisor he could name. What is the peril from a legal standpoint, or from the point of view of our law enforcement, of the president continuing to sort of wave a red flag in front of very serious investigators and very serious prosecutors now looking into this question of collusion with Russia?
Well, I think there's a big risk. I mean, we do know that his counsel, both internal and external, has privately advised him that he probably shouldn't be tweeting, that any tweet or sort of comment of this nature could be seen as a piece of evidence in this investigation, which we know does or may touch on obstruction of justice. And anything that he says, particularly if you can imagine Jim Comey out there making his story public, and it's not likely to be very flattering to the president, you can imagine him sitting there and really wanting to sort of engage on social media in the way that's natural for him, in the way that he communicates with his supporters and his followers. It's going to be a tough job to get him not to do that. But the other issue is that, you know, there are very few people in this White House who are going to be completely walled off, as much as they may try to wall themselves off from public statements on this, from possible legal jeopardy. And whether or not they were a witness to anything, whether or not they were present for anything inappropriate, many of them going to have to retain counsel if they haven't already, and really watch what they say and what they're able to learn about what the president is doing, just because they can't be in a position, or they don't want to put themselves in a position where they're, you know, privy to conversations that could be in this investigation. And that is a really bad place for any White House to be. It's very difficult to get anything done, to have the conversations that you have to have, the sensitive conversations around policymaking and everything else, when there's that kind of pressure hanging over you.
Yeah, and Nicole, remember that in every special counsel investigation that I can recall, whether it's, you know, Ken Starr into the Clinton matter or Patrick Fitzgerald about the disclosure of a CIA name, the crimes that ended up being charged had almost very little relation to the underlying thing that was being investigated in the first place. And that's the real peril here for the Trump administration and for the people that are caught up in this investigation. These dozens or however many FBI agents that are now looking through financial records and communications are not going to ignore any other crime that they find.
All right, Ken Delaney and Julie Davis, thank you so much, two of the best reporters on the beat. But joining me now at the table, Jen Palmieri, who is